Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters Podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today.
You can hear about, sort of data analytics and data engineering and data science and AI, and there's lots and lots of different terms. Broadly speaking, data science is this marriage of sort of programming and computer science and coding skills alongside the sort of statistics and visualization, business intelligence and mapping, all of that. There is always going to be something that can be improved, even if the big improvements have been made, moving from sort of horse-drawn fire engines to sort of modern fire engines. That's an enormous improvement, but there's still something else that can be improved. The more we chase these small continuous improvements, the more the role of sort of data analytics and data science will be important.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together. Apollo, welcome to the Firefighters Podcast. How you doing, my friend?
Very well, thanks. Good to be here.
Thank you for coming on. I know in your world, you're an incredibly busy individual, and I think I first came across your stuff probably through LinkedIn. I work with a few people in my own service and different services around trying to better understand data analytics and stuff like that. And in a previous life, I was a CI lead, so we did all the Kaizen and Six Sigma and all of that sort of stuff. But before we get into the weeds and the rabbit holes that I'm hoping we're going to go down today, because there's loads of exciting stuff we've got to talk about, could you please give everyone a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of who you are, kind of your introduction into the emergency services and your career path into where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I say, my name is obviously Apollo Gerolymbos. I work for London Fire Brigade as a head of data analytics at the moment. I have a second hat with the National Fire Chiefs Council since 2019. I've been the national data lead, coming through a couple of secondments in the NFCC as well. So I worked for the building safety team for 6 months in 2021, and also the digital and data program more recently. Operationally, I've been a volunteer in the fire service in Greece since 2007. So, every summer dealing with large wildfires, things like that. And then I moved to the UK to study. I studied business, organizational psychology, and ended up working in sort of finance and market research area. And in 2014, actually, I found a role within London Fire Brigade, and I joined as a senior analyst, sort of combining what was up till then a hobby with the operational side of things, with the career, which was the data and the analytics. And I found it, a fascinating opportunity. So I applied and got the role, and I've been with the LFB since then. So coming up to 10 years. I also keep in touch with academia a little bit. I'm currently a sort of teaching fellow at Birkbeck in the School of Business Economics and Informatics. So any opportunity I can really to sort of talk to people about data and the fire service, I do like taking that up, and hopefully spreading the word and some of the things we'll discuss today.
Mate, I think it's absolutely fascinating. I love the fact that you've managed to sustain keeping all of those hats. That might be something that we close with after we go through the plethora of wide stretch work that you do, because I think that in itself is a very difficult skill set. It's something I've struggled with for a long time in my life, wearing difficult hats and just being able to apportion everything. But I suppose they all kind of complement each other, which you seems like maybe strategically or connecting the dots looking backwards, you've done that quite well now, because all of these kind of feed each other as well, I suppose.
They do, and the sort of at the very high level, it's just about keeping people safe from fire, and whether you do that, on the front line, with a branch in your hand, or whether you do it in the office, or whether you do it, out inspecting buildings, or as you say, the plethora of things that the fire service do, and having a bit of experience, in other countries and so on. It's all pieces of the same puzzle, really. The academic side of things, we've had a lot of projects and things we will cover, where we've partnered with, universities and had really interesting students with, life experience in completely different sectors coming into the fire service and working with us. So it all fits together quite nicely, I think. I don't think I can manage to do anything else on top of what I'm doing. But as I say, the part operational, part sort of civilian, sort of office roles, for me, it works quite well.
Don't get too bogged down in the ethereal and the theory and too much of the analytics. Like you say, you manage to balance it with some of the practical aspects, because otherwise you lose your finger on the pulse, I suppose. But before we get too far down that first rabbit hole, one of the presentations that I did look at, one of the many that's available to people, and we will. Are you happy for me to put some of those links in the notes for the podcast so people can go away and look at some of the other great? Because I'm confident, despite the fact we're going to attempt the impossible today and speak about some aspects of your career, we will fail, and I will take responsibility for that failure, because we'll miss out some really crucial bits. So we'll drop some of those links, if you're happy with some of the ones you provided me, to I think some of the YouTube videos.
Yeah, please do.
Awesome. So there's a great quote in one of them, the Jeff Bezos one, where he speaks about, and it ultimately comes under this whole umbrella of marginal gains, but there is not a single category of business or government or anything that cannot improve itself. And the Fire and Rescue Service is a wonderful example of lots of isms and lots of that's the way it's always done. And it's a very traditional, one of the oldest services that we have. So when we start to talk about things like data science and marginal gains and how we can improve it, but in the application of which we're talking about it today, and for people that are perhaps unfamiliar with the term, how would you best describe data science, the different factors within it, and I suppose its application to the sector that we're discussing today?
Yes. So, I mean, these things have been called many, many different things. And you can hear about, sort of data analytics and data engineering and data science and AI. And the terminology is, there's lots and lots of different terms. And they do get quite confusing even within the industry. People, are not really sure if they're data analysts or if they're statisticians. Or if they're
are they
scientists.
interchangeable? Is it like the psychologist versus sociologist discussion, or are they principally different, some of them?
In a large organization, they will probably be distinct roles. Okay. Of course, the smaller the organization, the fewer people doing those roles, inevitably, the broader set of skills each person needs to have, and the more the sort of crossover or overlap between these roles exists. So broadly speaking, data science is this marriage of sort of programming and computer science and coding skills alongside the sort of statistics and visualization, business intelligence and mapping, all of that, and also the domain experience, which we'll come to a bit later on. Now, within that, obviously statistics in and of itself is a huge field. Data visualization in and of itself is a huge field, as is programming and computer science and all these other things. So it's a good umbrella term, I think, in my mind, to sort of try and capture all the different things that we do with data. And some of those are mundane and sort of necessary daily tasks and regular reports and so on. Others are much more on the sort of, experimental side. But I think as a one term, data science kind of captures all of it. As you say, there's a lot in there also about data ethics and, data management and so on, which, you could pick any number of terms for these things, but information management overall might be another option. But my sort of specific niche, I suppose, within my service and the sort of teams that I manage is much more around, the liaising with senior officers and firefighters and so on, and presenting data to them, analyzing data and so on. So it's more in the sort of data science as opposed to the overall information management. But as you say, in terms of the quote that you mentioned, I think it really speaks to this concept of there is always going to be something that can be improved, even if the big improvements have been made. I think I referenced in my presentation, moving from sort of horse-drawn fire engines to sort of modern fire engines. That's an enormous improvement, and so, but there's still something else that can be improved after. So I think the more we chase these small continuous improvements, the more the role of sort of data analytics and data science will be important.
I think what I love most about it is that a lot of people sometimes are waiting for big innovations. They're looking for the really massive levers where they can be global changes. And, you read books by Simon Sinek and stuff like that, and people are very much in love with, I want to make a difference. And making a difference to them speaks about colossal innovation, like conversion from the combustion or from the horses to the combustion engine, something like that. But most of the low-hanging fruit and the truly exponential compounding difference comes from all of these marginal gains. And I know you reference obviously Dave Brailsford, and a lot of people will probably be familiar with the British cycling team and the books that he's been involved in. When you first started walking into this realm and first started seeing a lot of that low-hanging fruit as your operational side, both from when you were working in Greece and then moving over to the UK, what was your first introduction to the fire and rescue services understanding, or even the emergency services understanding of how this could be applied? Was there a sell? Did you have to try and prove its validity and its application to people? And when you do have conversations with people that are perhaps unfamiliar, and I would include myself within that realm, how would you sell the benefits of where this can be applied? And then perhaps if you're willing to give some examples of the projects that you've been involved in where we have seen some of these marginal gains.
Sure. So when I first started in LFB, a lot of the projects that we were doing at the time were about essentially migrating like older reports into a more modern platform. And in essence, this was saving people time. So giving them back, half an hour a week, an hour a week, whatever it was, to make the process of accessing information in order to do their job a little bit more streamlined, a little bit easier, and offering up, actions within those reports. So if people were wanted to get a list of addresses to go and visit, for example, adding in things like Google Map links or anything that would allow them to sort of reduce the number of clicks and windows that they would have to navigate to get the information they needed to do their job, and trying to offer that up to them within sort of a single portal that they can access, from their laptop or tablet. Obviously, that's not so much a result of doing sort of analysis, but in order to find those reports that are the most used and the ones that people access regularly. Obviously, there is data about the usage of data reports as well. So, sort of a second layer down. And all of that is just in trying to improve a little bit that efficiency piece. So, how can data analytics, the presentation of data and data analytics improve, the organizational efficiency, let's say.
So that sits within that realm of sort of programming and coding skills, I would imagine. Because like you say, historically, if we think about all of the reports that we have written, submitted, and have been filed away somewhere, when I think of data analytics and programming, computer skills, coding skills, stuff like that, it empowers people with that holistic sort of zoom out view of being able to connect the dots, identify trends, and get a comprehension and a wider understanding of what all of this stuff we've been collecting is actually telling us.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned writing reports and filing them away. I'll bring one example of a piece of work we did on that point, where we looked at the incident records, the added to incident records by our fire investigation team. And they will attend, obviously, more serious incidents, a couple hundred words narrative around that incident. And largely those reports were just saved in the database and perhaps accessed, on a case-by-case basis when they were needed. Now, we did a project with a data scientist as part of the business case to recruit a permanent data scientist, whereby we extracted all of those free text reports and analyzed them in bulk using natural language processing algorithms at the time. That was really interesting because it was the first time that we'd done any natural language processing. It was also the first time that we had analyzed text in bulk, and it was also the first time
that has got to be a game changer, because before that, if things didn't exist in a tick box form, then it was harder to be able to create trends because you didn't have these language learning models and where like AI comes in today. Whereas now, with innovations like that, you can actually retrospectively go back to a lot of these reports, and it's not like dead data, is it? You can actually still drag all of that out, which is going to be, I mean, that would be incredible to see those data sets.
Yeah, exactly. And, back when we did this project, there was no chat GPT or there was no large language models or anything like that. So we used the tools that were available at the time. And when I say at the time, we're only talking a couple of years ago, but the tools that were available when we did the project were a little bit more basic, let's say, than the ones available at the moment. So to that extent, it's also a little bit like we are playing catch up because, this is quite a new thing for the fire service. I mean, it was the first time we'd done projects like this within LFB, and we used those projects as case studies to then help influence, obviously the business case to recruit the data scientists and create as a sort of full-time team.
I'd love to pause and double click there. Sorry to interrupt you, because I know before we spoke, we were like, we wanted to give people tangible takeaways. So if we can double click and zoom in there for a second, imagine you were going in consulting, which you may in fact do, I don't know, for services and organizations that are where you were. So for people that are unfamiliar, you've got a team of 10 plus, I think it's 15 something people that work with you. For people that have just got their first data analyst or whatever, what were those? And if I could ask you to be really specific, if you're able to, around like the tools, the resources, whatever companies or things, if someone said, look, we've got 30 grand, we're employing one data analyst, what resources do I need to give them to be able to get some good initial returns? Some really, not simple, that sounds condescending, but do you understand what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, so I would explore partnerships with universities because, they have a never-ending stream of students at sort of, let's say, master's level and above that need projects to do. We've had a few great results by working with universities and students. We've also partnered with some sort of data science consultancies. One in particular at the time was offering sort of an 8-week sort of proof of concept project type package whereby they would embed someone in your organization for 8 weeks and work on something or a business problem or some new sort of more innovative business case together with you, and these are the sorts of results you can expect within a shorter term sort of ad hoc case by case study rather type project whereby someone comes in the organization, you help them understand the data, you give them the tools and the data that they need, they analyze it with you, and you can go backwards and forwards on the results and come out with some really good insights. And then what we did is we took those insights and that process and we said, well, this is the sort of thing we can be achieving more regularly if we grow the team a bit, hire a data scientist, invest a little bit in training and tools and so on. And I suppose that applies to any other part of the fire service too. You're not necessarily going to just throw a big bag of money at a problem. You might want to trial it first, for example. And that's kind of what we did. So some of the more sort of experimental projects we've done have been through partnerships like this with university students and departments or consultancies and so on.
What were some of those infancy projects, or like if someone were going to take a bit of leap of faith, which sounds harsh because there is colossal amounts of evidence that shows this stuff is well worth the investment within it. But what were some of the early returns that you saw in the early projects, without getting into the intricacies of obviously anything personal to do with LFB, but from a data set perspective, what were some of those initial taskings and things that, if perhaps services aren't already doing them or haven't already attempted it, what could they start to look at where you were able to justify and build these business cases or larger teams?
Well, one example that comes to mind was, again, a number of years ago, I saw a report by the Emergency Number Association, 112, where they were doing a project using Waze, which is like the crowdsourced live traffic app. And they were, using live data from Waze to inform sort of fire appliance selection and routing, and also using the platform the other way around to inform drivers of areas where there might, be incidents and areas to avoid and so on. So we did a project with a university student who was looking at the GPS coordinates of pumps en route to incidents, and looking at the decisions essentially made by the system, and whether or not, if we had access to live traffic data, different fire engines would have potentially been selected for different incidents and so on. So again, it's about like moving from the old mobilizing system that didn't even use GPS to the new one.
Yeah.
You achieve really big sort of improvements in attendance times. And now we're trying to see whether, by informing the way the actual system does the calculations under the hood, if you can squeeze out a bit more performance. So in a sense, it's like, the horses to fire engines example. It's like the big performance gain has been realized by a massive IT project, but can data analytics help squeeze a little bit more out of that performance, and improve the system a little bit more? Same with the natural language processing project. We have a really in-depth data collection and incident recording system in the UK. It's far more in-depth than others I've come across, internationally.
Is it really?
Obviously, there's
this
challenges.
Is the natural IRS system that all services are legally required to submit their level 1s and level 2s investigations into?
Yeah, so the IRS is very in-depth compared to what some other countries have.
Wow.
And it's an excellent long-term data set for, fires in built environment and so on. But as I said, the free text recording did offer up some new insights around fires in kitchens, for example, because, a fire can be in a kitchen. It's recorded as a fire that the location of the fire started was in the kitchen. But the real problem there in the incidents that we were looking at was around the extraction ducting. So the buildup of greasy grease in the extraction ducts.
You gave a wonderful example of hygiene rating and the correlation.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I get excited sometimes, but no, please, Karen, because I found that one fascinating.
Yeah, so this is like a two-part project, basically. So the natural language processing allowed us to understand a little bit more about fires that started in kitchens but spread through the building because of poor maintenance and cleaning in the extraction fan ducting. And because we were then able to sort of retrospectively tag these incidents as due to greasy ducting, we were then able to build a data set of incidents that were relevant for that problem. With the food hygiene rating, we were then able to bring in that external data set about the food hygiene rating and say, given we've got all these incidents that are due to poor maintenance and cleaning, can the food hygiene rating now help us potentially target other restaurants that might have a similar problem, or if they do have a fire, might have a higher chance of having a serious fire that might spread to the roof, for example, or sleeping accommodation in the floors above.
Where did that trigger come from, though? Because that's a great thought process to overlay one data set completely external from the emergency services onto an existing data set, just to, because there's so many layers you could lay over these things to look, because there's always a difference, and my terminology is terrible, I'm pretending to know what I'm on about, but the whole correlation versus causation and whether or not these are red herrings or whether or not they're connected.
Yeah, so in the specific example, the hypothesis, let's say, was that a low food hygiene rating would put you at a higher risk of fire. But what the project showed was that actually a low food hygiene rating didn't put you at a higher risk of a fire. But if you did have a fire, it put you at a higher risk of having a serious fire, which was also quite interesting. Now, in terms of the idea, let's say, to do all this work and bring in the external data set, I'm not going to take too much credit for it, because the fire service has been doing this in other areas for a lot longer than I've been here. So you'll know that, when we do home fire safety visits, for example, those are targeted to an extent based on fire risk models and demographics and so on. So, we use external data sets for that.
They are most of the time, but I've been to a lot of affluent properties where I think to myself, what the bloody hell am I doing here? This was a waste of my time. I feel like it's a waste of, so I'm sure they are very few, to be fair, but sometimes the data doesn't manifest itself completely right. And that's not a reflection on the services that I've worked with. But yeah, you do need to add more layers sometimes, because you can still get tangents that tend to still slip through the net, if that makes sense.
That's it. And I suppose with obviously data quality is sort of an ongoing challenge for every data analyst around the world. But yes, if you can sort of, I suppose, triangulate the information by bringing in other data sets and, the sort of continually improving whatever model or calculation you have to do these targeting, then if you have the opportunity, you should. But for the project with the food hygiene rating, in essence, the data for food hygiene ratings wasn't available publicly with the sort of unique identifier at a property level. So in that sense, we
really,
yeah, it wasn't. It was public, but it didn't have, let's say, that unique property reference number on the UPRN. So we partnered with GeoPlace, who kind of look after the property gazetteer in the UK, and they sort of did all the matching, so that the address matching.
Yeah. So you haven't got to manually input addresses versus property reference numbers and all that jazz.
Yeah, because if you want to start building that calculation of, well, this property's had a fire, this property's had a fire, but this is what their food hygiene ratings are, you need that unique identifier, let's say, to tie it all together. So these are sort of the prerequisites in order to do that project, was to have, these bits and pieces in order. And we actually ran the second half of the project with the food hygiene rating. We ran it as a sort of a hackathon where we invited analysts from different fire services to use different skills and different technologies and tools. So we didn't sort of say you have to use this tool to do this. And we sort of came up with lots of different ways of joining those data sets. But yeah, for that example, the overall sort of outcome, I suppose, was just a better understanding of the problem, really, which we then sort of spoke about and shared with senior officers and firefighters who were interested in that problem. And that's where you marry up the data analytics and the actual professional expertise.
So how would that manifest itself practically? If we then ask ourselves, so we've identified a trend that they won't inherently have more fires, but of the fires that they have, they will be of more significant damage to property, and potentially if there's living accommodation above, blah, blah, blah. What would then, and no, you said like that's the point by which sometimes a data analyst or a data scientist has to step back and not get involved in the politics of the operational side. But were you able to share how that manifested a change in approach or predetermined attendance or whatever it might be for that data set?
Well, it didn't make a change in predetermined attendance, but that's a good idea. I mean, it would be nice to be able to send customized PDAs to properties based on a list of factors like the food hygiene rating. We didn't do that at the time, but I suppose the idea behind that project was, if you're going to make a big change in the way that you target businesses, for example, for regulatory fire safety inspections and so on, these are the sorts of things that you can consider. So we didn't really make any policy change at the time based on that project, but these are the sort of small proof of concept projects that we did, essentially, that just build up the business case to get data science in the organization. And that's a big step forward, for at least for our organization, I suppose the fire service as a whole, is that, embedding this stuff in the organization is like we're playing catch up with the private sector in some of this technology space. We all know that.
That's what I mean, where it's embarrassing, because like when you talk about some of those models like Waze and Uber and Google Maps, and the way they are already exponentially further ahead than us, and you'd like to think that your first responders and your emergency services, your government, emergency staff should be at the absolute precipice, tip of the sword of utilizing all this technology. Well, we are very much on catch up in a lot of cases, which is not out of malice, just that we are very unfamiliar. A lot of us are kinesthetic, more practically minded people that get attracted to the sector. But now that we don't have, or in many cases don't have, the knowledge and experience that people such as yourself and your teams bring to the table, we are playing that catch up.
Yeah, I mean, without quoting all of the big guys, I mean, Elon Musk said that Tesla is basically a software company that happens to sell cars. And you think about it that way, you think, well, obviously the fire service is not a software company that happens to go to fires. That's not what I'm saying. But the technology, I suppose, the data science, the analytics, the AI, was never at the very core of what we were doing. And I think in the last 5 years, 10 years, it's become more so the case.
We should be an expert in societal psychology, though, shouldn't we? Because if we're going to talk about prevention, we need to understand the subject matter, which is the public.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, in those departments, there's a lot of expertise that do that already. I'm just saying that, when the organization puts data analytics and data science closer to the sort of decision making, using these more modern tools and technologies, we're able to improve the way that decisions get made, but also improve the information that is used when those decisions get made. That's kind of the core of the message, really.
I wanted to ask you a question about IRS, if I could, because I don't know what impact you have on that or involvement you have on it from an NFCC perspective. But my thoughts, and I may be exposing my lack of knowledge in certain aspects, but that's absolutely fine. That's kind of my job on the podcast. But I think one of the limiting factors when we're talking about how much benefit can be gained from those contextual notes, that incident commander's impressions in their ability to put notes and comments and remarks and stuff into the IRS systems. And the services that I've worked for, they are heavily audited and checked because companies can request that information. And I know we might be getting into an area outside of your expertise here, but humor me if you can. Because people can submit requests for that information, we're encouraged to be very careful as to what we put into there. The downside to being incredibly careful about what we put in there is it limits sector knowledge, like it limits what our feelings and thoughts were when we were at those incidents, because at some point someone's going to apportion blame to something and the insurance or the person or someone's going to have to pay for it. But now that we're looking at these language learning models and stuff like that, if you had more notes, thoughts, experiences in there, I just feel like you'd maybe get more out of it. I don't know. Am I being wrong there?
No, I mean, obviously, but for the analytics side of things, obviously more data is generally better. You're right to sort of think about the privacy and sort of GDPR concerns there. That's, yeah, absolutely true. Obviously, any personal information that's recorded on incident records wouldn't be shared because it would generally go through the sort of FOI process whereby, the information access team or officer in charge of releasing information should be redacting personal information, things like that. Mm-hmm. But yes, there are obviously a lot of ethical and regulatory concerns about free text information, and generally we release free text information, especially on very large data sets, just because we don't have the resources to read through each free text record line by line. Yeah. When it comes to analyzing it, however, the data's in the background, so you're displaying like a front-end dashboard or visual or some form of presenting the data to the audience. You wouldn't be exposing the underlying data either. So, yes, you're right. Quality data is really important. Free text records, obviously, you want them to be longer, I suppose, is better because you capture more in there. But yes, stuff does get released and requested, and of course you would have seen through the inquiry into the Grenfell Tower fire. Obviously, transparency was paramount. Lots and lots of records got released, lots of documents and emails, and everything was accessible to the inquiry. So in that sense, everything that we hold could potentially get released and put in the public eye. Now, if it's a factual description of a fire and it doesn't contain any personal records and so on, I don't see why we wouldn't be able to, capture it honestly and so on. Of course, we've also got, in my service, I don't know about others, but we've got sort of incident monitoring, incident management protocols whereby comments are made about people's performance at incidents, and firefighter X can comment on firefighter Y's performance, and the incident commander can write comments and notes about people's performance, and all of that information is recorded as well. So there's a lot there in the free text fields, but yes, you do have to be very careful when releasing information that contains any free text fields. But that's why the IRS is so good, in my view, especially for sort of fires in dwellings and in the built environment, is that there's so many different data fields and categories that it makes you can analyze the data to quite high standard, without needing to go down the sort of free text route. Of course, when you start looking at makes and models of appliances and vehicle fires, which are quite topical at the moment with lithium and batteries and all of that stuff, then you start relying more heavily on free text fields.
We're going to need them to build that data set on things like these, because again, that is a massive example of where we are desperately trying to catch up with the technology. You referenced obviously Tesla earlier, but our education, our training, our infrastructure, our equipment, our policies, procedures, operational guidance really does need to catch up on that before any more firefighters, and certainly the public as well, get hurt by these things. Because I was speaking to someone very recently, and they were saying one of their biggest fears from an act of terrorism is that people will, I'm going to say hack into, and I know my terminology is wrong there, but these lithium-ion batteries, as an example, operate between a certain voltage, but they have a greater capacity within them. And if you were to simply alter the tolerance of one of them, they would naturally go straight into thermal runaway, because you take away that upper limit of sort of operational bandwidth. And then if you did that to 12 vehicles sat underneath a government building, you could, there's almost a portable bomb that someone's put there for you. And I know I'm going so far down a rabbit hole there, but all I'm trying to give an example of is that we don't know a lot of this information, and therefore our policies and procedures are crawling through the sludge of trying to catch up with some of this sort of stuff.
Yeah, and I suppose in this example, but any other example, step one is to sort of try and understand the scale of the problem. I mean, a few years ago, it was those hoverboards, wasn't it, that were catching fire. And it's like, well, okay, well, let's try and understand, well, how many are catching fire? Where are they being stored when they catch fire? And all this is down to incident records. We also had a case a couple of years ago with the Vauxhall Zafira air conditioning. There was like a string of Vauxhall Zafira fires all of a sudden, and fire investigation, the data analysts, they were all sort of bumping heads trying to figure out, how to best sort of understand the scale of the problem. And that led to a recall, actually. So
wow.
On the back of that, we even had fire services from abroad, from Croatia specifically, were asking us for incident records, data about vehicle fires, so they could try and understand the scale of the problem in their country. This is what I'm saying when I said the IRS is actually really, valuable data set, because it has so many incidents with good detail. Obviously, the quality, some people query the quality at times, and absolutely data quality is important, but it's data set that gets used, even in other countries to inform their own local prevention, protection policies, strategies and stuff. So it's very, very interesting. And as you say, there's no end to the sort of examples where you can, and we do use sort of analytics to help specific problems. Today it's lithium-ion batteries. Tomorrow, what will it be? Maybe, I don't know, jetpacks.
You gave a wonderful example in one of the other things I was looking at around property fires and sort of energy performance ratings, and then the concerns people have off the back of things like Grenfell, and what actually the data is saying about property types and things like that and likelihoods.
Yeah, so again, that was another example of thinking about what other external data sets we could bring into the fire service. And the energy performance certificate at the time had just been released with the UPRN, that unique property reference number on it. So it allows you obviously then to tie it down to very, very specific building level and incident records, and then given that now you've got a data set of all buildings with all property certificates, and you've also got a data set with all buildings which have had fires, obviously you can filter out sort of commercial buildings and marry those two data sets together and then start looking at insights. And again, we partnered with a consultancy who loaned us essentially a data scientist for 8 weeks. And through that process came up with this model of all buildings in London and all buildings that have had fires. And the insights were really interesting in terms of properties with certain characteristics in the energy performance certificate. And, it contains things like whether they have single or double glazing, whether they have central heating or not, and so on. The energy performance certificate was actually a pretty good predictor of fire risk within a building, on par with demographics, which we already use to target home fire safety visits, but far, far superior to things like building height, which was obviously very, very key at the time. Now, we still target home fire safety visits using sort of demographic data. But the question there, which I ask, is, should we use the energy performance certificate? Should we use a model that contains a bit of both? Or is there another way to sort of to do this? So I'm not saying these projects have had immediate sector-wide impact, but they show you
it's a
the data
cultural change, isn't it? You need to continually present these pieces of evidence to add to the side of the scales that no one's put any weight on. And forever would probably be an extreme exaggeration, but nonetheless, the weight is very much more heavily weighted on the way we've always done it.
Yeah, and a lot of this depends on organizations within London and within any city or any area publishing, quality open data. We publish every incident attended, every fire engine mobilization publicly, so members of the public are able to view that information, but also analysts sometimes take it and do their own projects with it. So hopefully they get in touch with us, and then we can do something slightly more in depth or interesting together. But there's so much data out there, publicly available data about cities and localities and so on, that there's a lot more we can do, really. I mean, we're just scratching the surface. As I say, we're sort of playing catch up. There's opportunities left, right, and center for data sets. I mean, one I talked about recently was tree cover. You're looking at tree cover within, well, anywhere, but for us, it was sort of within London. If you have a data set about tree cover, you can then start to, look at other things like the weather, and you can think about, well, the growing sort of problem of wildfires and where tree cover is connected. If you have a fire in if you have a fire in within a sort of wildland area with trees, tree cover is quite important, because that can show you how fire might spread if trees are touching and they're close together and so on. Now I'm thinking much more with my experience from Greece, but in that sense, having a view of where large connected paths are on the tree cover canopy or whatever, that can sort of help you understand problems like that. So, and all this,
and then you could do preventative action. Like I know in America we had a gentleman who wrote a book about wildfires, and they do a lot of preventative work in terms of environmental maintenance, for want of a better description. So maintenance of their forestry and all that sort of stuff, and active cuts and burns and stuff like that. Because if you thought about it like you think about the layout of a warehouse as an example, you wouldn't allow everything to be clustered together. You'd create separation in certain, and you'd have a limitation of areas. And of course, overlaying that on the sustainability for wildlife and like connective places where animals can migrate. But all of those data sets overlaid onto each other would certainly be useful from a preventative action with wildfires.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's all of these examples. You can go into incredible depth, and there's experts for each of these pieces of the sector. And I think it doesn't matter what you're working on, really. It's almost a given that data will help in one way or another. It might be batteries, it might be wildfires, it might be inspections, or system mobilizations, whatever it is. Having data, having people that can understand it and analyze it is really important. And I guess that's where the sort of much more strategic idea of data literacy within an organization comes in. And I see that as a growth.
That's a great point. Expand on that for me.
So, I mean, data literacy, again, is just a label, really, and there's definitions about what it is. But for me, it's just about, the overall baseline understanding of what data is and how it helps, and the ability to sort of interpret information that's being presented to you. So, analysts, we're not really talking about analysts here. We're talking about the rest of the organization. The analyst's job essentially is to do all the analysis and presentation, but present the data in a way that makes it easier for non-experts to
they're like a translator, aren't they?
Yeah, to sort of consume that information, understand that information, and then go off and use the combination of the information and their own professional expertise to go off and make the decisions that they need to make. But I did a piece of work recently with another fire service where they asked me to talk a little bit about, sort of the headlines and what data is and why it's important. And with the idea that they push that out as a sort of video to all their staff to try and increase or improve the data literacy of the organization. And I guess it's like, if you're going to be looking at a performance dashboard, or if you're going to be writing an email to a local councillor or something about the fire service performance in that area, data literacy is essentially, the sort of skill that you need in order to confidently interpret some KPI figures or statistics and go off and present them in your local meeting or something like that. And I think, it's all of these real life case studies make it like an interesting field to actually be involved in, and therefore help improve the data literacy of the organization. And hopefully even this podcast, to an extent, will help in some way improve the data literacy of the people listening to it, because hopefully I'm making this subject, which is quite technically difficult, accessible. And that's really the point,
I think there's loads of ways in which that can be better utilized and better explained through people such as yourself, because there is a tremendous economical value to what the fire and rescue service do. An example for me that I often give is when we're talking about breathing apparatus and fire behavior and people's exposure and people's competency level, because a lot of people argue that, well, we are losing a tremendous amount of skill set from the UK Fire and Rescue Service. A lot of people are retiring. So when we overlay that with the aspect of masses of recruitment and a low level of experience across a lot of UK Fire and Rescue Service, and then we talk about sending people into properties and premises where there isn't a fire, there is a known fire. Some people go, oh, it's not worth a life. And obviously, unfortunately, we have lost firefighters in the past few years in fires and other events as well. But my argument is always give people as much exposure as you possibly can. A, because it's another opportunity to increase their skill set, because you're therefore making them less likely of hurting themselves because you're exposing it to them at every given opportunity. But also some people say there's no savable life in there. It's not worth a firefighter's life. Don't send them into the building. But then if you argue the economical value of the hotel that's on fire or the local business that's on fire and the 100 people that they employ and their children and their families, and them losing their job, or having to move out of the area, or those 100 rooms in that hotel that now has no one visiting for the next 12 months whilst it gets rebuilt. When you start to understand those things, so I know I may have gone down several rabbit holes there, but could you expand on what I'm probably trying to articulate there in terms of the economical value of what the Fire and Rescue Service does?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. There was a project done many years ago about sort of the economic and social cost of fire, and that project was refreshed recently, and it's publicly available for people to look at. There's also a working group run by a senior officer in Canada who this is exactly the sort of research that they keep track of and try and understand and build on about what is the full extent of the cost of a fire. And then obviously the NFCC also put out a piece of work recently that looks much more at the economic and social value of the fire and rescue service. So, granted, this building, if it burns, the cost is X, but then there's a wider social cost and environmental cost and so on.
That's
and so
it.
forth.
It's the ripples. If you extrapolate that out, the cost is actually colossal.
Exactly. And then, of course, the fire service who do a lot of prevention. So obviously we invest money in prevention, but, what is the value of that investment over time, given that it will have prevented, hopefully, some of these large, costly things? And it's very difficult to do because you're trying to calculate the value of something that didn't happen, and also prove that it didn't happen because of what you've done to begin with. So it's very difficult, and honestly, the people involved are far more intelligent than I am. And I've, obviously the project is publicly available, so anyone can go and read the methodology. But it's really interesting, and it's the sort of thing that we'll, the sort of data that we'll be using in the future. When someone says, well, why do you do, 50,000 of these home fire safety visits? Well, you'll say, because of this published and widely peer-reviewed accepted research, the value of these 50,000 visits is actually 5 times higher in terms of prevented losses and so on. So that's the sort of thinking, I believe.
Can I ask you to give some insight into, when people talk about wanting to be more productive, as an example, and they say, we need more money. And I remember one of the things I heard you speak about was how busy your fire service is and the thousands of things that we do. And we spoke a little around the economical outcome there, but the time that we do spend doing prevention, inspections and training and stuff like that. And where do you, I know it's very much putting you on the spot, but where is our time best placed, or what are some of the myths or beliefs that perhaps some of the data sets have helped shine a light on the fact that perhaps they're not the best place that we spend our time?
I think I'd say it's a myth, but there's sort of two sides to it, really. One of the myths, is that, the fire service, let's say, isn't busy. But then if you look at, the average number of incidents attended and the number of, let's say, minutes per day or hours per day that fire engines are either off the run or available or committed to an incident or en route to an incident, you'll get an answer, you'll get a sort of clear idea of what it looks like. But then you have to look at the busiest days to understand what it could look like. So it's one of these things where you look at averages and you miss, the extremes. Now, some say, the extremes, well, they might be outliers, but they do happen. So when you have the riots or Grenfell Tower or, the wildfires or flooding events, the service does get busier. And the whole point of that project was to try and visualize how that looks like in minute by minute throughout a day. And then you're able to then look at, if you have an understanding of how many fire engines were either available or unavailable on a minute by minute basis, you can then actually see the impact of operational decisions like making up a fire to, bring more resources in, for example, what the impact that had on availability, and then how, if that happens closer to a shift change, it will actually, leave you with a smaller residual availability than if it happens, halfway through a shift change, for example. But again, it's about
That's a great point. How many decisions do you think happen on the basis of optimum times for shift changes? Because there is a lot of variation across the fire and rescue service workforce in the UK around the way that shifts run. And I think in a lot of cases, they're not best placed. And I don't believe a lot of them are supported by data in terms of doing it optimum times, both for employee welfare and our time traveling and commuting and all that sort of jazz, but equally the busiest times for our public as well.
Sure. So obviously the shifts and the shift change times are what they are, and they do vary. I haven't been involved in work recently that specifically looks at shift changes, and I know that lots of people have their own preferences of what the working hours should be and when the optimum time for them would be to change shifts and so on. So what I mean is it's more about, given that you have this spike in unavailable pumps around the shift change, whenever that shift changes, that's not part of the question, that there will be an impact in the availability when there are shift changes. Same like there will be impacts in availability when you have peaks in sort of demand and incidents, sort of 7-8 p.m. time. So that's the sort of thing. It's like we know that we have these changes in availability throughout the day. Up till recently, it was quite a simple way of viewing that. If you wanted to understand how many fire engines are unavailable or how many fire engines were, tied up at an incident, especially looking back. So, if someone says, well, yesterday we were really busy, can you show me exactly how busy we were minute by minute? And then they can say, well, that point was the point at which the fire was made up. That point's the point at which there was a shift change. So it's giving a much clearer picture of answering some of these questions. And also, as I said, when people ask you how busy you are, we have to start off by picking apart that question and defining, what do you mean busy? Do you mean at incidents? Do you mean driving around? Do you mean training? Do you mean some sort of community prevention work? What is that? So we also don't have data that says or understands for an entire 24-hour period, by every minute. We don't know what people are doing every minute of every day. And to some extent, we don't need to, but if you do have a training booked, and it's booked in your calendar, for example, if the analysts have access to that calendar, then they can bring that data in and say overall, what people spend their time doing. And I think, you can use that to decide when the best time to schedule training is, or you could use it to decide when the best time to schedule some of your community safety work is. And you would probably not want to do it during peak demand for incidents. And you probably wouldn't want to do it around shift changes because there will be bigger impacts on availability. So it's answering those sorts of questions and answering them at a greater level of detail than we were previously able to do. And part of the reason behind that is that we've now got access, to all this data at a very sort of granular level.
One of my concerns around the proving how busy we are and proving what everybody's up to. One of obviously the big focuses across the fire and rescue service now is the cultural aspects of things. And whilst I'm not going to ask you to comment on the intricacies of different services or even your own brigade's cultural reviews, when we try and quantify where is that time best placed, culture grows in the times when you're doing lots of stuff, even when you are just spending time on station, perhaps not with anything in particular in your diary, and you're having group discussions, you're having, whatever those day-to-day activities might be that build teams, that builds culture, that strengthens those relationships. My thought is that, similar to the Grenfell analogy, whereby we had a fire in a tall building, so a lot of fire and rescue services went out, knee-jerked, and bought a new turntable. They bought a new aerial ladder platform, when inherently you could have had another 50 aerial ladder platforms an incident like Grenfell, and it probably wouldn't have correlated to a better outcome for the incident, because there was very limited places you could put one at Grenfell as an example. But nonetheless, they knee-jerked out and did try to do something about it. If you overlay that behavior onto the cultural aspects, there'll be a lot of services looking for solutions to the cultural answers, deficits, challenges, whatever they are in their own services. And then when you look at the diaries of people, quantifying the need to focus on that and put time into it will probably be a very difficult thing to answer. And that's a very long-winded, grey, murky question to pose, I suppose.
No, but I understand the concept. This is not about spying on people. This is trying to make things easier and better. And if, previously people were saying, well, why was this training, for example, booked on this day or something like that? Inevitably someone somewhere in some team is going to be looking at some data and trying to book trainings at more suitable times, for example. What I'm saying from a data analytics and data visualization perspective is that's a challenge for us to help those people do their job by giving them the information in a more easily consumable way, either using dashboards or visualizations or so on. But also, it's, as I said earlier, it's a data literacy thing around helping people understand information and use it to make those small marginal gains in their day job. So, yeah, I mean, all these projects, whether the subject of analysis is internal data or external data, whether you're using it to improve a tiny little local process, or whether you're using it for a big ticket item like attendance times, the fundamentals are the same. You need good quality data. You want to do it ethically and protect personal information, visualize it and offer it to the customer, let's say the consumer of that, in an easily digestible format, and make sure that's all done, using all sort of best practices for data ethics and data protection and so on. So in a sense, it doesn't really matter what part of the service we're talking about. The fundamentals will always be the same. For me, this is about trying to find those areas of improvement that won't require much effort or investment, but can be, achieved relatively.
It's that effort reward matrix, isn't it?
Through
trying to, not low effort as in we're trying to shirk responsibility or hard work, but a lot of things some of the solutions are readily available to us if we can just interpret the data correctly.
Yes.
Has there been any data collection and whatnot done? Because I want to ask you for I know there's a myriad of other internal and external examples, but one of my questions around staff welfare and mental health, I know is something that you commented on one of the presentations that you gave, because again, one of my big concerns and kind of one of the purposes of the podcast is to ensure we do have people that want to continue to be part of the first responder community. They want to be part of the emergency services, and certainly they want to be part of the fire service, because recruitment is challenging. Do you know of any data sets and research that's been done into staff welfare and mental health, and perhaps anywhere we could direct people to, or even solutions that you've come across within your own teams?
Yes, there are a lot. I mean, the biggest ones that I'm aware of published have been done by, external charities like Mind, firefighters charity, and there's probably multitude of other examples in the US and in other countries. From within the service, it's a lot of it is about understanding, stations and understanding, obviously, staff demographics, presenting information about, the makeup of shifts and watches, and looking at recruits and looking at people retiring and people leaving the service pre-retirement, and understanding all of that staff information, staff data that we hold, but also tying in other things like how far is the station from people's homes, what are the sort of number of incidents these individuals attend, not just station performance figures, but like individuals, what incidents do they attend?
I think that'd be a great data set in terms of traumatic incident management, being able to map the number of fatalities that an individual has been exposed to, or even just challenging incidents, because it hasn't always got to be fatalities. Trauma is, exists in many different ways, and not just for operational staff either. But we don't seem to have the ability to track something like that. I mean, breathing apparatus as a micro example, we track how many times we put instructors into fire behavior scenarios in a lot of services and their exposure levels and what's appropriate and when they need to sit it out or when they can't wear again for a week or something like that. But to my very limited understanding, we don't have that data set available for people's experiences with trauma.
Why not? I mean, you have information about incidents, you have information about pumps attending, you have information about staff shifts and who was on those pumps and which incidents they attend. You can tie together incidents that were of a certain severity upwards. It might be a road traffic collision, it might be a fire, whatever, incidents where there was at least, let's say, one injury, or if there was a child involved or anything like that, tie it back to the individuals that attended those incidents, look at their demographics, look at the demographic makeup of the station.
Mate, I think targeting that customer audience, I think targeting that data set may be useless, but personally, just from a visceral feeling, I think that would produce some useful data if we could question, submit, survey that audience, that data set. I don't know if that's been, do you know of anywhere that's been done?
Within services, probably. I mean, they have access to this information. They'll often use it to trigger sort of a counseling and well-being process following challenging incidents. And I think, it definitely, as I said, any data set, internal or external, that can help understand more about the service and improve people's experience of working there and try and increase the number of people wanting to work in the service and reduce like early people leaving before retirement and so on. It's all available. It's
Mate, I think it's available. I agree with you, but these are my words, not yours. I don't think it's being used. I think we are still very much in that reactive stage for trauma, whereby your fire engine goes there, we send an officer out, or we send a member of the trim team out to speak to you, your watch, your team, and then we just try and support you in the future. As that happens, we might have a 28-day follow-up, a 6-month follow-up, but I don't think the resources have been made available, or it's been considered enough of a priority, even though we know you could extrapolate out the cost of someone going off sick for a very long time and the cost to the service financially, the cost to the watch, the team, the skill sets, the culture. I'm sure all those numbers could be pulled out of the data and correlations and trends made. But this is my personal opinion, and I live inside my own bubble, my own silo, my limited information. But I don't think that's being given enough weight personally, or maybe I'm just not looking in the right places.
Again, there'll be a number of services that do, a number of services that don't, and all the services in between will to some extent. And I can't say, for a fact which one services are doing that. But what I do know is that, again, if you look outside, you have huge organizations with hundreds of thousands of staff, and they have much stricter processes and procedures for staff management. And there's a lot to learn from other organizations in this space.
Are we getting better at that from your NFCC perspective? Because since things started to separate out, services all started doing their own things, and then we tried to pull it all back together with things like NOG and things like that. I think there are still a lot of examples of siloed working. From your national perspective, are we getting better at sharing that information in national, regional groups? I would probably hazard a guess that the academic world and people such as yourself are probably better at that, because you recognize the benefits of utilizing other people's information and data sets and working collaboratively together. But historically, we've been pretty poor at that. I think the public would be astonished as to how many different ways we approach incidents on a national scale?
Sure, but on a case by case basis, you have the freedom and flexibility to partner and do projects internally, externally, share data as you want. So yes, we do, but I can't speak for other services. Same with publishing open data. We publish open data. A lot of other services publish open data, but we don't all publish the same open data, and that's something that we're improving.
Why not? Is there a disagreement of what the KPIs are, or is there just localism? I agree. I appreciate the demographics and the geographical layout of different services, and London's high rise and population density and its hazards are very different than, say, Cornwall or Scotland. But there definitely is surely some agreed principles and sort of non-negotiables.
Why do you say definitely? I mean, this is
that's probably a sort of out of hope.
Well, look, in other countries where fire services are part of the military, you won't even get a single incident record out of them, even if you ask and use whatever freedom of information laws, and you just won't get anything. So the fact that we are already talking about publishing open data in the UK is a huge step forward for fire service globally. And I think we publish more open data and more detailed open data than probably any other country in terms of fire service data. And the fact that some services don't publish the same as others now is a marginal gain. So we can talk about,
it's more the attitude that's improved, that our attitude and our willingness to share that. Do you think that helps to improve cultural trust in organizations? Because globally, some nations have a very poor relationship with their government and their emergency services. I romantically like to think that we are pretty good. I know some people are very distrustful of the police and stuff like that, and sometimes that's simply the nature of the job they have to do. They're not going to be everybody's friend. But I've always liked to think, and please tell me if I'm wrong, that the fire services approach to the public has helped nurture quite a trusting relationship, I like to think, with our end customer.
Yes, and that's evidenced by research done by services, usually as part of their community risk management plans, where they go out and ask the public, what do you think of us, and do you trust us, and whatnot. And I think there's surveys like that. It's all public information as well. So yes, we do have that level of trust. I think publishing open information, open data sets, it can't hurt. If anything, it improves, because it shows that you're being transparent. That's one of the key principles behind sharing open data, is transparency. You're publishing your senior officer expenses, you're publishing incidents you attended, you're publishing your every fire engine mobilization. So even if people see your performance statistics and your attendance times in your high-level KPI reports, they can go off and use the same data and arrive at the same conclusions that what you're publishing. I mean, we publish a series, more like a research style report, called Fire Facts. About we've got one Fire Facts that's about fires, and we've got another one about attendance times, and it talks in great depth and detail about the IRS and what data sets are out there, and how we calculate attendance times, and what we include in the calculation and what we don't include in the calculation. There's a lot of detail, and it's there if you want it. Now, Joe Public probably doesn't read that Fire Facts report.
How digestible is it, in your honest opinion? Because I know, again, you're very much in the depths of this, so it will make a lot of sense to you. How digestible would it be for someone outside of the sector?
It is digestible. If you want an in-depth understanding of what fires look like in London, what they've looked like, since the 60s, and what attendance.
It goes that far back?
Yeah, it does. And if you want an in-depth understanding, it's designed to be a publicly accessible report. It doesn't use acronyms and jargon and things like that. It's designed to do that. But most members of the public won't have seen it, and most members of the public probably won't know what our average attendance time is, and they won't really have much understanding of how you manage a large metropolitan fire service, or any fire service for that matter. What they want, though, is for someone to show up at their door on that bad day that they have, and to arrive quickly. and that's about it. So, and you know this just as well as I do, that that's the expectation. So again, there's not much you can do for an average member of public to help improve their understanding of the service, other than the opportunities you have to contact them, which will either be at an incident, or it'll be at an open day, or a home fire safety visit, or some other activity. So I would say yes, majority of the consumers of our publicly available information and open data will either be anoraks like myself, or fire service enthusiasts, let's say academics, students,
sad people that run a podcast,
partner organizations, or esteemed podcast hosts. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe not, but no, I do, mate. I try and look at this stuff, and sometimes I fumble around. That's why I'm very much appreciative of people like yourself willing to hold my hand in a childlike manner and lead me through some of the confusing stuff. In a perfect world, if we could pretend to be there for a moment, and not pretending someone like the NHS is perfect, but the NHS, as an example, is a significantly larger organization, significantly more funding, and. We're always be limited by the nature of UK Fire and Rescue Service and the size of our organizations. But if budgets were unlimited, what things do we not yet have the capacity to do? And I know you're looking for thrifty ways to utilize. You've spoken about universities today. You've spoken about a few ways that people can try and get more support and resource. But Fire and Rescue Service versus something like the NHS, what are we not doing that we would perhaps benefit from doing, and where does the future lie in terms of data analytics, AI, where things could be going?
Well, I mean, in my world, I suppose if budgets were unlimited, I would hire more people and specific skills. For example, someone specifically to do natural language processing. And we go back to what we spoke about at the beginning of the discussion around what is data science. I would split out those roles, and rather than have, some generalists doing all of it, I would have specific people doing each piece. And then that would allow you to do very, in-depth concentrated projects, for example, on spatial analysis or natural language processing, or, AI and all of this, image detection, video recognition, all that sort of stuff, or even more in-depth things that are coming our way around sort of incident ground, real-time decisions on the incident ground.
What's that system where you can get a phone call and it taps into your camera in the control rooms? What's that? Do you know what that system is? Have you heard of that one? What's that one called?
Yeah, so we have that in London. It's called 999i.
Yes, that's wicked. I've never seen it used, but that looks amazing.
Yeah, if you call from a mobile, the control officer can send you a link, and you tap the link, it gives them access to your camera, and you can live stream video of the incident back to the control room, and then helps the control officers modify the PDA if needed to suit whatever they see on your camera. So that's good. Yeah, definitely.
That's a game changer. When we talk about that sort of innovation, that's, phone technology meets AI meets whatever else, because then, like you say, that visual recognition, the challenges of someone that doesn't live within the sector trying to describe what they're seeing versus the information that you want that would be useful to your crews and your tactical and strategic plan for certain incidents. And especially when we look back at other incidents, like the amount of visual information that was probably available at things like Grenfell, that would have been so incredibly valuable if you could capture it all, layer it all, and then use that for strategic decisions, versus you waiting to get there and put your drones up and try and make decisions later, for want of a better description.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about overall innovative technology as a whole. This conversation will go on for days, but another example, as an example, is you could have a large language model, almost like a personal assistant. And as you're, on the incident ground, almost like, hey Siri, this truck has XYZ chemical in it. There are, 3 homes in proximity. What do you think I should do? And it will check your fire service policies. It will reference similar incidents that have happened internationally. It will come up with a sort of action plan, suggest course of action based on all the information it has. And then you can take that and you can either throw it away, or you can use it, or you can modify it with your own professional expertise and what you're seeing on the ground. So do you see what I mean? Like almost like a...
Oh, mate, 100%. You could throw it through that decision vortex and it would punch out with the resources you've got available, whatever the different branches, the different rescue equipment, the quantity of X fluid and directions which you could attack it from. That would be incredible. And you could even go into, all right, this sort of building with this sort of fire separation, what angle has given me the most time? Where should I attack this from to allow the greatest level of success? Because maybe I'm going at it from this angle, but actually the point of failure is somewhere else.
Exactly. And, these innovations, I mean, you'll get them one day. They'll be built into whatever Rosenbauer MSA helmet technology alongside your radio and your heads-up display and your thermal imaging camera and all that stuff. So, it'll come. But again, I suppose from a strictly in-house data analytics team perspective, we then have to think, well, what expectation will staff have for information available to them, given that their experience with these larger companies and tools and technologies that they're using? And how do we need to change and adapt to meet those demands, really? So,
but also just like as a communication tool, you spoke about helmets and things like that. Then, when you're speaking to a community with, I forget, I looked at it a little while ago, but London speaks God knows how many languages. There's hundreds and hundreds of languages spoken in a really multicultural society like that. And when you're going up and down a building trying to evacuate people, if you had something that actively translated what it is you're trying to say, you could get better information quicker, you could communicate with people, and things like that would also be a game changer.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're talking now technology on the incident ground, technology on the fire engines, technology over at the control center, and then everyone's got a smartphone and a laptop. What information is being displayed. And at what point do you have to consider whether it's information overload or if it's actually something that is critically useful for the live incident ground? And if not, maybe it shouldn't be in the helmet. Maybe it should only be available back at the office when you've got a bit more time to sit down and process it.
Yeah.
So yes, there will be things that are available everywhere all the time, but there are things that probably shouldn't be available all the time, especially when you're in a sort of risk critical situation like on the incident ground.
You've got to manage that cognitive overload and that sort of decision fatigue, haven't you? Perfection, that sort of information overload where you just become paralyzed by trying to analyze everything at once. I love that we've gone in so many directions today. And again, if I were to try and force you to summarize some of the aspects that we've gone today, and again, maybe just flesh out the different aspects of data analytics that you've seen to be most useful and that are currently in existence, to maybe wrap up and box this conversation off for people to have those closing takeaway thoughts, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say that we are a very modern service across the world. I mean, we already do a lot of things really well. The concept here about the usage of data is around trying to figure out how you can track down those marginal gains, those small improvements that you can make every day. So, we spoke a little bit about utilizing data for operational efficiency, for example, how we can, enhance response times, how you can sort of better allocate resources. I offered up some examples of, predictive analytics for sort of preventative measures and, how you can sort of use historical fire data to look at future areas of risk, perhaps. Training, preparedness, how we can sort of improve the way training is delivered, as well as sort of, obviously resource allocation and bringing in external data sets like the food hygiene ratings, like weather data, and sort of thinking about high risk periods like, the fire season, if you want to call it that, and sort of what we see with summer wildfires. In terms of data-driven decisions as well, I mean, we try and, through the analytical process, we try and offer up, insights to officers in a very digestible way, to sort of help them, obviously make decisions, but also to do it in a way that plays to the data literacy of the organization. And just, I suppose, finally, what we spoke about a bit around the technology and the tools, there's a lot of sort of ethical and privacy concerns. You've seen an example the other day in Northern Ireland, still ongoing, with leaks and so on. We have to be obviously very mindful of the information we have. It is important information. We need to protect it and make sure we only share what we can and do that all.
But I don't want that fear to come at the cost of us being timid to step further into this world, because this is where we need to go.
Absolutely. And, it is a very exciting part of the sector. I'm obviously very passionate about it. And the future trends are really exciting as well. Things like, as we spoke about, augmented reality, sensors and AI, and how data analytics could play a bigger role in real time on the incident ground, whilst also being mindful of, overloading people and their precious time with too much information. So really that combination of the data and the analytics, but also the domain experience and the expertise of people and their experience, bringing those two things together.
I think when we get that connection of data analytics with virtual reality and training and simulation, and I know people will argue that it never beats the real thing. Yeah, okay, it never beats the real thing, but from a cost and exposure and repetition perspective, flight simulators have been around for God knows how many decades, and they've proven themselves incredibly valuable in making people more proficient and safer. If we recognize those models and then utilize the data that we gather from investigations and real-time incidents and videos that we've captured from social media or body-worn cameras, I think that is somewhere where we have only really scratched the surface as well. I think there's just so many directions this can go in. It's like we're in the center of a map and 90% of it is still grayed out. We could go in any direction, still get so much benefit.
And I mean, in an airline, they're not going to use the flight simulator to teach you how to fly a plane. They're going to give you scenarios that you can go over, lots and lots of different scenarios of things that you couldn't really replicate in the real world safely.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so a lot of those scenarios were really interesting. And obviously virtual reality is already being rolled out in many services, with sort of VR goggles, and mainly for incident command training as well, but also for public education, things like road safety and all of that. So,
and we'll ride off the back of the proliferation of that in sectors like gaming and stuff like that. So it's not like we've got to do all the investment and be the pioneers exploring these areas. People are laying out that landscape in front of us.
Exactly. And the same applies to my area. We're not coming up with new ChatGPT algorithms. We just need skills within the service to be able to utilize them to maximize their sort of impact within the service.
That's my only big concern as well, because people with your skill sets, and I'm blowing smoke up your ass here, but because it is a public sector, blah, 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 we need to be ensure we're attractive enough as an employer to get this sort of top talent as well.
Yes. Recruitment is a challenge and has been, and retention as well. There are obviously many benefits to working in the public service, and in the fire service specifically, you are doing good in essence every day. So
it's very morally fulfilling, but like in the old hierarchy of needs and Maslow's hierarchy, there's lots of other boxes we still need to tick, because some people won't just do it because it is a good, fulfilling thing to do for your community and your fellow.
Absolutely. And especially when you get into the very technical roles where staff just want to do that, they just want to write code, or they just want to do, explore the algorithms and things like that. They probably have a little bit less, let's say, brand loyalty to working for the fire service.
Yeah.
Perhaps than someone like myself, who's maybe a little bit less technical, but a little bit more strategic, also has some,
you're a unique hybrid because you've got the background in it as well. So you kind of come at it from both desires, from both sides of the coin. There's different motivators for you than perhaps would be someone solely from an academic or technology background.
On the other hand, the skills are very transferable within the data world. So it doesn't matter if you're analyzing, Tesco delivery lorries or fire engines. Really, you're still looking at data about resources moving around the city, for example. So it doesn't really, like, the skills are very transferable. So,
mate, absolutely. In a morbid sense, I think, like, if some of the high level people that work for Amazon, if their family were to experience some tragedies, which I sincerely hope they do not, but I think to myself, when things happen in people's lives, or their family is rescued, hopefully from a tragic incident of some form, and they go, you know what, I want to help make a difference in that sector, that'd be great. But we don't want to have to wait, and we don't wish it upon people's families either. So my hope is that they just want to come and work in this sector, because it's a great thing to be part of.
Of course. And, Amazon have a emergency services technology reach out team or something now, I believe. I spoke to them recently about the smart homes and things like that, and what sort of data is available for them. And like those Internet of Thing connected doorbells and video doorbells.
Yeah, if we could tap into, in the appropriate manner, those Ring doorbells. But equally, companies like Google, they say Google is a data management, data acquisition company, isn't it? That's their biggest product that they have, that they sell, that they leverage. And Amazon, I don't know how the politics of it works, but I imagine they're all tapping into the same ocean somehow.
Yeah, exactly. But likewise, these doorbells, for example, they have apps, and you're a member of a community, and you can help notify fellow community members about things. But then, if they had fire service data in there as well, they could notify people about fires and things like that. But then you have to think about, well, that's great, but not everyone has these apps. So who are we excluding? And if we do want to be inclusive, we have to think about people that might not even own a smartphone as well. So,
yes, but I don't think the barrier of inclusivity, and I know we're attempting to wrap it up as we've gone down this next rabbit hole, should be a barrier, because, like you say, if there's a marauding terrorist in an area, you want to notify people, and not everyone's got the thing, okay, but for those that have, I think we should still be doing it.
Exactly.
Mate, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really enjoyed that. We've gone for like 2 hours in a blink of an eye. So as I sort of spoke about before we came on, I'd love, once this comes out at some point in time, once it's all been produced and whatnot, I'd love to perhaps do a follow-up conversation, because I'm sure the both of us will think of a myriad of things that we didn't discuss, and I'll kick myself for all the questions I didn't ask. So it'd be wonderful to revisit this at some point, perhaps.
Yeah, that sounds great. And, I'd love to come back. Thanks for all the questions. And, I think, you say you don't have a great understanding of this area. I think you do. The questions show that. And so, yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Well, mate, we're not going to compliment each other to death, but I will say one final piece, which is most academics that I have spoken to and that I know, and I know you perhaps wouldn't class yourself as an academic or however you choose to identify yourself, but most people lack the skill and the willingness to also come out and talk about these things publicly, because public speaking is I think it's the number one global fear still. So it's a big thanks to yourself. I always say the people that should talk about it the most are often willing to the least, because they're scared of the ramifications professionally, or they're scared of embarrassing themselves and being seen as something less than perfect. But you embrace that student mindset where you're always willing to learn, you're always willing to discuss. I always say the podcast is learning out loud, and I try and do the best job I can at acting like the idiot in the room and asking all the questions that I know is probably on the minds of many of our listeners. And you've facilitated that for Dave for me, so I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I do definitely identify with a lot of those fears, but, got to practice.
You got to go for it, my man. Thank you so much for your time today, mate, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.
The Firefighters Podcast was created to recognize, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our drive and purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests, and as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, tallies, and also access to all of the incredible documents get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders, and please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening, and wherever you're in the world, please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.